Did you know in Vietnam, it's possible to buy your way off death row? Let me explain. If you embezzle enough money there, the punishment isn't just prison time, it's death. And this Vietnamese billionaire has been sentenced to die.
Truong My Lan was the mastermind behind the scheme to defraud the Saigon Commercial Bank of more than $12 billion.
A property tycoon has been sentenced to death in the country's biggest ever financial fraud case.
She was found guilty of siphoning from one of the country's biggest banks hundreds of trillions of dong. That's the local currency, worth nearly $17 billion Canadian. She tried to appeal her death sentence, and she lost. But there is a way out. It involves scraping together billions of dollars as quickly as possible.
To commute that death sentence into life imprisonment, she has to raise 75% of the $12 billion.
Yes, if she can pay back most of what she stole, she doesn't have to die. So how likely is she to win her survival? And how did she get all that money in the first place? The crimes of Truong My Lan have been called one of the greatest bank frauds the world has ever seen. And it all started with a bank she helped create. 3 banks, strapped for cash, merged with her oversight to create the Saigon Joint Stock Commercial Bank. Now, she didn't own that bank. There's actually a Vietnamese law that prohibits any individual from owning more than 5% of a bank's shares. So, according to prosecutors, she faked her way into near complete ownership. Hundreds of shell companies and people acted as her proxies, buying altogether more than just a controlling interest. By the end, Truong My Lan owned more than 90% of Saigon Commercial Bank. Then, according to the evidence, she appointed her own people as managers, who would then go on to approve billions of dollars in loans to all of those shell companies that she had set up. Those loans added up to about 93% of all of the bank's lending.
She had so much money, she was paying off all of the state regulators who should have been shouting out warnings about the way in which she was controlling the bank.
This went on for more than 10 years. Prosecutors figure about $27 billion US was misappropriated. For context, that's about 6% of the country's GDP. Of that amount, she was found to have embezzled around $12 billion. And repaying most of that back is the price for her survival. You might be wondering why Vietnam has such a harsh punishment for what is really just a white-collar crime.
One Vietnamese academic put it to me very well. She said, in Vietnam, like China, money is God.
And Vietnam has seen incredible economic growth. Here's the last 10 years, their GDP. That's wild, right? Vietnam's been called the next China. But historically, corruption has been a big part of doing business there.
It is a widely accepted feature, not a bug, of many systems, including the Vietnamese system.
They're trying to keep total control, political control, over an increasingly wealthy and ambitious population, but they cannot afford to stop the engine of the economy. You know, they're addicted to growth, and with growth in Vietnam comes corruption. It's a dilemma that they haven't solved.
But they're trying. Hundreds of officials, even presidents, plural, have been caught up in a massive national crackdown, hence making an example of Truong My Lan, who stole an unbelievable amount of money. But the only thing more important than punishing her is getting that money back.
People were panicking, they were pulling their money out of her bank. People were starting to worry that other banks might be affected. So getting the money back makes an awful lot of sense, and they've given her the best possible incentive to do that.
This is the driving force behind a key section of Vietnam's criminal code. Article 40 on the death sentence makes clear corruption-related crimes are punishable by death. But much earlier in the code, leniency shall be showed towards criminals who voluntarily compensate for damage they inflict. And in the case of a billionaire who stole billions from the people, from the country,
they want the money back. This was an enormous fraud.
The Communist Party leadership has built its legitimacy upon economic performance. And the fact that corruption has been so rampant, so widespread, directly challenges its claim to this performance-based legitimacy.
You know, it was such a spectacular fraud. They had to make an example of her, and I think, you know, they will make her sweat on death row for a while.
For as long as Truong My Lan is alive, she will be singularly focused on raising the required 75% of the amount stolen. Of $12 billion US, that's around $9 billion. So now, the billion-dollar question is, can she pay? Many years ago, Truong My Lan founded a real estate firm called Van Tin Phat, VTP for short. It was among the country's richest real estate firms. Its portfolio, full of hotels, shopping centers, office buildings, luxury properties, one of Ho Chi Minh City's tallest buildings, Saigon Times Square, among them.
She was almost a queen in Ho Chi Minh City in Saigon. She was so powerful.
This is where there is the greatest hope of recovering the money. In all, the state has identified more than 1,000 different assets linked to the fraud, and there may be others.
These are some of the most iconic buildings in Saigon. If you looked at a property portfolio of Ho Chi Minh City, of Saigon, and looked at the most valuable buildings there, Truong My Lan would own a very significant chunk of them, perhaps 20-25% of those buildings. I mean, she is a property magnate.
And her lawyers seem confident she can raise the money. The total value of her holdings actually exceeds the required compensation amount, said one lawyer to the BBC. And according to one appraisal firm in Vietnam, the total value of assets linked to VTP could be between $12 and $48 billion.
Technically, she should be able to hit 9 billion, but everything depends on whether you can sell all the stuff you've got.
And therein lies the problem, because Truong My Lan is a billionaire on paper, but she's also desperate.
You can imagine it, anybody wanting to buy a property from her is going to think, well, she's facing the death penalty, because she's definitely a distressed seller. I can get a great price.
Now, let's be clear, she is unbelievably wealthy, and the prevailing belief right now does seem to be that she can buy her way out of the death penalty. But death is the price of failure, and from what I've read, it is impossible to know when exactly that penalty will come. So, she's on the clock, her life on the line, and life in prison as her best possible outcome.